two roles. I'm academic liaison officer, so I connect the specialist group activities with universities and try and bridge the two together. And my second role is that of inclusivity officer. So I promote diversity and inclusivity within the group. So welcome to today's webinar, the role of data strategy to enable value. So I'm very pleased to welcome Ian Wallace to speak about achieving value through data strategy. The presentation will start shortly and end at 7:30 p.m. In terms of housekeeping, only the presenter microphones and video cameras are on. Everybody else's microphones will be muted. So therefore, if you have any questions, please can you submit your questions or comments into the Zoom chat window. The Zoom chat window is being monitored through the webinar, and questions posted will be addressed after the main presentation. A video of the event will be posted on the BCS Data Management Specialist Group YouTube library a week or so after today. So before going on to the webinar, I would just like to mention some future events that the BCS Data Management Specialist Group are running. So some future webinars on the 28th of April, there's a webinar called Fast Data Fast. The presenter for that webinar is Smith. He has a huge amount of experience on database technology, and he'll be looking at how to manage real-time device data which is used for making split-second decisions. So the examples given there are autonomous vehicles, smart motorways, or sensor data where we've got high volume, high speed data, and it can be quite challenging to manage. So the webinar will give us some valuable insights from on how we can do that. On 20th to 24th of June, we have the DMSG and Dharma Collaboration Conference, annual conference, which this year is going to be on open data. It's the recognition that data sharing has lots of benefits, but also it's got some issues and challenges. So it's quite apt really, because I think this year is the 10th year anniversary of the Open Data Institute. So we should have some good speakers from ODI discussing the challenges and benefits of open data. A word about how the conference will be run. There will be it's a series of 10 one-hour webinars on the subject of open data. The first webinar of the day will be held at 11 o'clock till 12 o'clock, and the second webinar every day will be held 4 till 5 p.m. So 2 webinars a day, which is good really, not too densely packed. So today's webinar is all about making sense of all the data that is generated these days and deriving some value from it. Data is increasingly being recognized as important to organizations that, and clever technology can't sort of overcome the data quality issues. So Ian is going to be talking about developing and implementing a data strategy which will help us to ensure that we focus on the data that's relevant and will help us to give us some value and focus our efforts on that important data. I'm very pleased to welcome Ian Wallace, our presenter for today's webinar. Ian Wallace has over 30 years experience in data and analytics programs across many household names within both public and private industry sectors. He's author of a data strategy book, Data Strategy, a comprehensive guide covering end-to-end process of successfully embedding data and its exploitation into an organization. The book has received lots of excellent reviews. So welcome, Ian. Welcome to the webinar. I'll hand over to Ian now without further ado. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk about data strategy, and in particular the book that I wrote in collaboration with BCS at the back end of last year. So I've got quite a lot of material to cover, so I'll move through at pace to ensure that we have the opportunity for some questions towards the end of the session. So we've already mentioned my background. I've spent a large part of my career in financial services, in public sector roles, and working for myself through my own company, Data Strategist. My background really started in analytics and moved into data. The two are sort of inseparable, I guess. And I have found that across all of the sectors I've worked in, whilst data has become more important to many of those organizations, many of the challenges that existed 10, 20 years ago still pervade today, which was one of the catalysts for me to actually look to write the book, to try and help organizations through how to write a data strategy and to realize value from it. So the book is based very much on practical experience. It's my experience of seeing how organizations approach managing data and how to link defining a strategy to, importantly, being able to implement it and see it through to realizing value within an organization. So first up, I guess, why would you need a data strategy? What does a data strategy do? Well, data is ubiquitous. Every organization has it, use it to underpin decisions. And fundamentally, decisions do cost money. Get them right, it's a sound investment. Get it wrong, and clearly it's a major drain on the organization. So access to good quality data increases the probability of success, and yet many organizations do not invest significantly in data, which we'll come to. Data as an asset really needs management focus and continued investment. And I see a data strategy as giving clarity on these to ensure that there's purpose and direction, from compliance, data security, all the way through to being able to exploit it and getting those things in balance, because that is the important part of it. Many organizations focus on maybe one or two of those things, don't really recognize the need to get those things into balance. I see data as linking people, process, and technology. And by that, I mean that triumvirate of things that we do within our organizations, of employing people to undertake processes using technology, all require data for them to work. Otherwise, those three things really have no purpose. And the success of an organization really should be measured in how well it achieves its corporate strategy, its objectives. And in many ways, the data underpins that. So data strategy, in my humble opinion, is essential to being able to underpin the success of a corporate strategy. In terms of what a data strategy should contain, this really depends on where the organization is in its maturity. But I believe at a basic level, a starting point is that there needs to be a very strong data management vision of what you're seeking to achieve. And by that, I mean, from the point that you're starting from, what is the improvement or the journey that you wish to undertake? Are you an organization with very fragmented data, poor quality data, data that's not compliant? And what's the vision that you are on to be able to address those things, to be able to get them into a better place? That leads into having a coherent business case that would support investment, which could be those resources could be people related, not just necessarily financial. But if you have that vision, then you are in a position to be able to start to structure a business case to be able to realize that vision. There should be the guiding principles, the values, the alignment to that corporate vision or strategy to be able to show how the data strategy is working in tandem as an enabler of the corporate strategy, and clearly articulated goals that are related to data as to what you're seeking to achieve. Evaluation criteria and metrics are essential to track the success of a strategy, whether it's a data strategy or any other strategy for that matter. But in this particular case, many organizations don't really have a view around the quality of their data, the use of their data, the value of their data. So putting this into place, I see as quite a key element of having a data strategy. And that clarity on how you turn a strategy into an implementation program as a vision needs to be defined and delivered. There is no point in defining a data strategy and then having no understanding of how you would implement it. I have seen many organizations that have delivered data strategies that I would term shelfware, where they've never actually seen the light of day. Many people in the organization don't even know there is a data strategy because it never actually got to the point of implementation. And then finally, clarity on the roles and responsibilities. Who's doing what to be able to enable that data strategy to succeed? So if we have a clear view on what's in the data strategy, we understand where we're starting from, then the content of the strategy should fall from there. So setting out the purpose of the data strategy. Are you going to be compliance focused, trying to shift the organization to be maybe insight led in the way in which it uses its data? Use it as a lever for innovation and driving value from data? Are you on a digital journey where you're transforming the organization and investing heavily in a digital first approach, and therefore the data needs to align to that? There are many reasons why organizations might want to define a data strategy. And in many ways, understanding from the outset what your purpose is in defining a data strategy is probably the most important thing you can do. If you don't understand why a data strategy is required, why it's being commissioned, then the chances of success are probably low. I would suggest that understanding the purpose is the clear starting point. Setting that out as part of the content of the strategy then enables you, through an introduction, to use that context to define what you mean by a data strategy.
I am not going to accept this negative attitude. If you don't understand,
I think somebody's just come off mute.
you can ask me, but I do not want to hear, I will never understand it. I don't understand it. This, that, okay?
I'm not sure if someone can...
All of this is the problem.
I think we've solved the problem. Okay, so once you have set out the context and defined what you mean by a data strategy so that it's clear and aligned to your corporate strategy, that sets you up nicely to be able to focus on the two aspects of data: the management of it, which covers everything from data governance, security, compliance, standards, and so on, building the foundation for how you use and manage data within the organization. Potentially using a data maturity model, but there are many out there, to demonstrate the current and the future state that you wish to get to. And then the data exploitation, which covers the reactive use of data for things like reporting and MI, as I often call it, the rear view mirror. If you think of a car, where you're looking at where you've come from, And then the proactive use of data, the analytics, the insight, the AI, that big windscreen at the front, which is where you're heading, and trying to interact and predict with the future to be able to influence outcomes. And getting those two in balance is important, because they both have a role. It's not that one's more important than the other, but having the connection between the consistency of data that you use in a reactive space and the proactive is obviously an important step. So where would you begin and why is the question. So I suggest that clarifying the scope, ensuring that you have the same understanding and reference point as your key stakeholders is absolutely essential. If you have any variation in what people think the data strategy is there to do, then you will immediately find yourself at tangents, having slightly different views as to what the outcome should be. So ensure that the scope is clear. Understand why the data strategy is being commissioned. So what are the drivers? What are the expectations of the audience, and particularly the senior stakeholders of the organisation who commissioned it to begin with? They must have an expectation, whether it's as basic as they've been told by somebody or another organisation that a data strategy is really what they need, or whether there is a reason why maybe someone's joined the organisation, that someone's brought some expertise into spotting a gap and saying we really need a data strategy. If you understand why it's being commissioned, it makes it easier to be able to manage those expectations. And assessing the readiness and the maturity of the organisation when you begin sets your baseline. That becomes essential to the implementation. If you don't understand the baseline, it becomes very difficult to track future progress. Identify who is going to be an effective sponsor. This may sound obvious, but try to understand, if you have the opportunity to identify a sponsor, somebody who has the influence within the organisation, a level of understanding as to why you are developing a data strategy, and who is going to be able to influence whether it's resources or the importance that's attached within the organisation to the data strategy. Following on from that, developing a stakeholder matrix that enables you to understand who are the people that you need to engage with becomes essential to having a plan around a communication strategy. So understand what the personal drivers are that may be at play. If you're in an operational environment, for instance, it may be that you are interested in how the data strategy is going to enable you to be more effective in the operational delivery. If it's a finance function, it may be driven by cost. It may also be where I wish to invest, and how will better quality data enable me to make better decisions. There are all sorts of different drivers at play, and understanding those as part of the stakeholder mapping becomes key to be able to tailor the communications. I would also suggest that you need to spend time to consider the structure of the data strategy based on the goals and also that baseline that you've established, because that enables you to understand how the data strategy will be interpreted and how you can then demonstrate your progress. In many ways, the type of organisation that you're operating in, what are the core strengths of that organisation, and where is the corporate strategy driving to, should enable you to tailor a data strategy to be able to reflect where the importance might be. And aligning to those core strengths is almost certainly going to be in keeping with what the corporate strategy says. There are models out there. There's one around competitive strategies that you can use for this sort of purpose. It really helps break through the complexity of an organisation to understand at its base level what type of organisation you are operating in. And balancing the foundations, as I said, the data management activities with the desire to be able to exploit data and to realize the value from data is always a tricky balance. There's often a desire to rush ahead to, how do I get AI working? How do I start to use data science in my organization to release value? I gather that's where all of the interest in the marketplace is. That's where we need to be. But without the data to begin with, and the reliability and accessibility of the data, those activities are liable to end up in frustration and being suboptimal. So the balance of data foundations and data exploitation are important. But also consider quick wins, because in many cases, what you need when you're on the data strategy journey is to be able to get confidence that this is going to bear fruit, that this is actually an activity that is not just visionary, not just about changing the organization 3 years hence, but can actually release benefits through the course of that strategic period that you're covering, whether that's 3 years, 5 years, some organizations even do strategies over 10 years. The quick wins build support, confidence, and advocacy, and can't be underestimated in terms of the value and the benefits that they will bring to your data strategy. I always say that keeping the data strategy grounded is something that you should use as a reference point. And by that I mean setting out the basics, setting out the understanding so that there is clarity amongst all participants. So clarifying that scope so that there is the same reference point for key stakeholders becomes very important. It's very easy for people to misinterpret, to try and redefine things over a period of time. And the classic project scope creep applies just as much in the strategy space as to any other type of activity. Having that base point, that baseline, the same understanding of what the scope is always a useful reference point to come back to. That also enables you through the commissioning process to show what are the drivers, what are the expectations, and therefore why the priority of your data strategy is as it is. That will also then flow through into the priority you give to the implementation. If you don't assess the readiness and the maturity of the organization at the outset to establish the baseline, then you do build a bit of a challenge around how you proceed through this. So again, it's really important to have that baseline. As you transition into the implementation phase, you will need to do some preparation. And by this, I mean, don't just leap in. Don't just think, right, I've got the strategy done now. It's a case of getting it implemented. There is actually a strongly held belief that implementation and being ready for implementation is a strategic activity in itself, and it needs to be handled accordingly. So I'd always suggest conducting a pre-implementation review. And by this, I mean, in many organizations, the implementation activity isn't necessarily undertaken by the people who have defined the data strategy. So what you may find is that you need to understand some of the thinking, some of the assumptions, how the data strategy evolved into being what it is. And there were probably iterations of the data strategy based upon conversations that may or may not have been recorded. Understanding that evolution becomes really important because that will also cloud the expectations of the implementation phase. I always recommend undertaking a mobilization phase, and at one stage mobilization activities seem to be really popular. I think in many cases that's sort of dropped by the wayside, but I always see a lot of benefits from a mobilization phase of getting those who are involved in an implementation of a strategy together to understand collectively what it is that you're seeking to achieve, how you're going to go about it, to be able to share experience and brainstorm some of the ideas that people may come with, to be able to shape that implementation so that everybody feels like they've got a stake in the process. And I'd extend that mobilisation as well to other stakeholders, to those areas in particular who are going to be at the early stages of the implementation, and therefore who you need to be getting on board very early on in your implementation activity. The failure rate of strategy implementation is remarkably high. There's this particular instance, Carucci in 2017 identified that strategy implementation across the board, this isn't data strategy, strategy as a whole in organizations, the failure rate is at 67%. So 2 in every 3 strategy implementations fails. Now that's quite a damning statistic in itself, but also further to that, 50% failed in the first year, and a fantastic phrase of "we fake it till we make it." So it's going to be really apparent if you are on the right track or not, given that half of strategy implementations fail in the first year. This is why, for me, the pre-implementation review and the mobilisation is really important, to set out clearly what you are going to achieve, to get everybody lined up in the same direction, and to get your early adopters, if you like, the first parts of the organisation that you are going to be interacting with, aligned to what it is that you're seeking to achieve. Those successes in the first 6 to 12 months will mark the following 2 or 3 years of the strategy implementation. Get off on the wrong foot and you'll be in the failure rate of the 67%. It's that stark. You must assess the alignment between the data and the corporate strategies. If the data strategy isn't enabling the corporate strategy, then I would suggest it's almost certainly doomed to fail. There is no way that a data strategy should be focused on things that are not in the corporate strategy, unless someone has got the corporate strategy horribly wrong. But given that the corporate strategy in this scenario would have been signed off and agreed, then I think that your expectation is that your executive in the organisation are committed to that view, and your data strategy needs to work out how it can best enable that to succeed. I suggest that before you get underway, you should review the dependencies. They will have been identified in the course of defining the strategy. There's probably a RAID log of some description. Understanding what those dependencies are and getting those tracked from the outset becomes critical to your success. The data strategy should have way markers, so general indicators of the progress over a period of time that's expected. Those need to be converted into hard milestones as to what's going to be achieved by when. And then you need to plot a course. You need to define a plan, but recognize that you need to be agile and flexible in the approach to that plan. As with all plans, they don't survive first contact, so be prepared and ready to have to adapt and change the plan. And don't think that that's a sign of failure. You can learn a lot from what you do. As Voltaire said, certainty is an absurd position. There's really a need to learn and adapt as you implement. I also suggest conducting a capability assessment, and in particular a capability assessment of the team that are going to be delivering the implementation. This isn't to necessarily challenge the capabilities of those people, but it is to identify what gaps and also what strengths you may have to be fully aware of how to use those capabilities to the maximum. So we have got to the point where we're delivering the data strategy. We need to assign roles and responsibilities. I typically use a RACI or a RASCI, the S in the middle being for support. I know some people think support features elsewhere. I actually like the RASCI. I think it's a useful addition, but it's whatever you prefer. Be prepared and also review along the way where change is going to arise, because it will. The inevitability of organisations is that change happens all the time. But at the same time, define and communicate your plan with confidence, because confidence in the plan will transmit itself to other stakeholders. And if they do find opportunities to do things differently that are beneficial, then at least the plan has prompted those conversations and you are prepared and ready for those changes coming. I also suggest that you develop a comms plan from the outset that covers all stakeholders, regardless of whether they're the executive layer, the sponsor, the department heads, or the organisation at large. You need to tailor the approach in that comms plan and also be very opportunistic by utilising other messaging. There will be lots of communications on all sorts of topics across the organisation. I come back to data is at the heart of everything in an organisation. You don't have to be overly creative to find a data angle to be able to add to most messages. So do be opportunistic. Look for those chances to be able to get your message in about your data strategy and the implementation journey that you're on. I always say adopt the agile approach in the implementation. This is simply because of the element of change. I also suggest that you seek to blend the skills and experience that you have within your implementation team and utilize the knowledge, the experience that people may have within the organization that you're operating in to the fore. Often they will have roots into teams and departments and functions that may be critical at points in time. Understanding that so that people maybe move in and out of lines of responsibility to be flexible to enable the implementation to succeed can often help. And underpin that with a strong PMO capability, because there will be a lot of moving parts to track in a large organization with a data strategy implementation. Prioritization and governance around the implementation is obviously important, and understanding how you're going to do that and communicating that to your stakeholders gives a level of transparency that they can buy into and they can challenge, and you can evolve as required. I would also suggest that a standard sort of requirements gathering process is used to capture what those deliverables within the implementation plan look like and get those signed off as you would with any requirements document. That helps give assurance around what you're going to be delivering, that you are on point with what's required in the organization, and ensure that the link between the deliverables and the value that they give is clear. So you need to capture benefits and track those through to realization to be able to demonstrate what value the data strategy has brought. You will find that the data strategy is really an agent of change. Any change to data will inevitably impact the rest of the organization. So do lock in with other change programs and keep aligned, because in many ways, they will be working to preconceived ideas that when they form their programs, they would probably assume nothing's going to change. If you're now coming along with a data strategy and you're going to be moving things along in that space, they need to understand that, and they need to be able to adapt and flex their own programs. Hopefully, they will be reaping benefits from what it is that you're doing, because they're probably having to build dependencies in around the weaknesses, maybe in accessibility or quality of data. And do embrace change through that whole implementation process, as I've mentioned before. You will find that across program implementations as a whole, a lack of agility and flexibility are often cited as common reasons as to why those things fail. I also think that change control is important. I mentioned earlier on that strategy implementation suffers in the same way as projects do with the potential for scope creep and for things to be shoehorned in that were never actually envisaged. If you don't have that change control approach, it's very difficult to capture and assess the impact of those changes, and also to communicate the change that you are going to make to your implementation and why. And communicating the change and the why are essential to get people on board with the approach you're taking. There will be resource constraints. Do raise those, escalate as required, whether they're people, whether they're financial. If they are going to hinder your implementation, then you need to be on top of that and to be able to address that with urgency, or else you will fall behind. And do anticipate that the implementation team that you forge will change inevitably. People will move on, opportunities will arise. You should plan for it, and you should mitigate the risks through things like shadowing people within the team, learning and development, succession planning. There's all sorts of different ways in which you can start to provide a level of cover so that changes in the personnel within the implementation team can be managed. I've mentioned maturity assessments previously. They do work well to give clarity on the progress of change. They are very visual, they are easy to explain on the whole. They do give a level of assurance that there is a format that you are working to be able to show where you're heading and the progress that's been made. You will also find that in a lot of organisations, information literacy isn't perhaps as high as you might think, and people lack confidence in being able to use information, and therefore when you come along talking about data strategy, people think, oh, this isn't for me, it's far too complicated, that sounds like something that's very specialist. But data is something that people use every day of their lives. Breaking down the barriers and giving people confidence around information literacy is really important, and it helps to be able to bring people to engage with what you're trying to do rather than resist it. There are lots of ways in which you can track how, as an organisation, you're progressing to become a more data-driven organisation that's generating real value and moving up the curve from simply looking at data to transforming that into information and into intelligence. This is one that I've used, as I say, many others out there that you can use as a framework. So how does data strategy deliver value? And I think this is the crux of why I'm talking to you today, but also why you would want to undertake a data strategy. It should be focused on how you release value. It shouldn't just be about removing risk. So data exploitation, the shiny bits as I described them at the start, are key, because this is the way in which you unlock the value and realize how the investment that you've made in the data can bear fruit for the organization. Without that baseline position that you started out with, it's very difficult to demonstrate the value that the data strategy implementation has actually realized. So there are evaluation techniques out there that help you measure impact and the sustainability of change. I recommend those. I use them regularly myself in this sort of work, because they provide a level of rigor in how you do this sort of thing. And do track benefits throughout the program, because without being able to show week in week, month on month to your sponsor that you are making progress, their enthusiasm, their confidence to be able to influence will probably wane, and you don't want to lose your sponsor. Providing them with performance metrics will really help, as will the maturity assessments, because they're very visual, as I say, in being able to demonstrate the progress that you're making and where you're trying to head to. If you are to move forward, then within your organization, data needs to become treated as an asset. I often describe it as the new water in the organization. The technology and the processes might provide the plumbing, but this is about the water that flows through there and the quality of that water to be of sufficient quality. So applying techniques around how you value data will also help educate and prioritize the way in which you determine which activities you're going to invest in and treat that asset with the same care and attention you would any other asset. And one that I use in the book that I have used many times is that water is a standard commodity in many parts of the world. It's a litre of water in the UK, if you turn on the tap, would cost around a penny. But water, just like data, can degrade if it's not properly maintained, and when we expect a quality of water when we turn on that tap. But water can also be used for so many other things, and my favourite is that champagne is 85% water, although not necessarily straight from the tap. So you can think about how, in data terms, you're turning your water into champagne. And I think that this is a really good analogy, in my humble opinion, of how you can show that investing in data can really benefit your organization in making decisions that are worth millions. And coming back to my earlier point, if the data is of a good quality, then you get really good decisions. If it's not, then you don't. So some final key observations just to wrap up. You may well find barriers that may be cultural. It's not necessarily proactive resistance to change, but don't underestimate the impact or the effect that inertia and a lack of imagination may have on progress, potentially at all levels of the organization. You may well encounter this. Culture will pervade any organization, and you have to decide whether you're seeking to change the culture or trying to embrace it and wrap the culture around what you're trying to do. Both are valid, neither are easy, but you do have different tactics to adopt depending on which approach you take, and you may have a hybrid on the approach you take depending on the activity. You do need resilience, not just yourself as the person doing the strategy implementation, but if there's a team around you. It will be a roller coaster. There'll be high points, there'll be low points, as with all sorts of programs, and how you manage that is important. You may find that the data strategy needs to be revolutionary, moving the organization lock, stock and barrel significantly from where it is to play catch up with other organizations, or it might be evolutionary, where it's either difficult to make those huge leaps or the organization simply isn't ready for it. It could be a hybrid of those two options, but depending on the approach, again, the tactics will vary. And the triumvirate of being able to prioritize, manage the dependencies, and use the capabilities in the organization are really important to manage tightly to be able to strike a balance. You will need to manage stakeholders at every level. Do utilize the sponsor, because the sponsor should be the person who can really influence and make life easier for you. Communication, as I've said before, is a critical stream. It needs to be all pervading. You need to exploit all the routes to increase the footprint, because data strategy in itself may sound entirely dull, and therefore you need to find ways to really excite people about what this is going to do for them and how it's going to benefit them. Align to the corporate strategy, link in with those who oversee or own the corporate strategy, build that understanding so you are working to common goals. The implementation plan must be measurable. You need to track the dependencies and the outcomes if you are to demonstrate progress and value. And in many organizations, this doesn't happen, so that it's lost in terms of the value that's being realized, and can so easily be turned off because it's not seen to be delivering value when actually it is. It's just not necessarily visible. and do use Agile. Learn as you deliver, adapt and refine based upon what you know on any particular occasion, because you probably didn't know that at the outset, and that's not an unreasonable position to be in. You may well find that you can adapt and improve your implementation strategy based upon what you discover as you go along. So I'm going to wrap up now, just under quarter of an hour left. And Jag, is there anything that has come by in the way of questions that you would like to raise?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, Ian. That was excellent. I really like the data is the new water analogy. Yeah, we have some questions in the chat box. So I'll just start my way from the top and work my way down. So the first question is from Tim King. And he says, at least some of the organizations you've worked with own and operate complex physical assets. How does your approach to data strategy compare with the approach to strategic asset management in ISO 55000? What are the reasons for any differences? That's the first question.
Yes, and what was past 55 before that? So yes, I have worked in a number of asset management areas, and the fascinating thing is that I think with ISO, I think 55001, it explicitly talks about data as in terms that would more rightly align with it being an asset. I do think that in many ways the asset management world has maybe been slower to embrace data from a strategic point of view, but has more than caught up through things like ISO 55001. And certainly from my experience, trying to implement things like data governance and so on, that has been much easier in those sorts of organizations because the mindset is already in that sort of place. And so I think that ISO 55001 has been a real step forwards for those of us in the data community, and especially working in the asset management profession, to be able to really bring data to the fore and to adopt very similar disciplines to the way in which wider assets in an organization are managed. And I've often referred to it in those other organizations where they're not perhaps asset management organizations not familiar with ISO 55001, to be able to highlight those sorts of standards as the sort of standards that we should also be looking to adopt. So yes, I think that that's been a real positive in my experience.
Brilliant, thank you. Hope that's answered your question, Tim. Next question is from, let me see, Tom Gill. And his question is, can you give examples or methods of dealing with data quality such as security, recoverability, portability, etc., in particular for making their objectives quantified requirements?
Okay, sorry, I missed the very first part of that.
Yeah, can you give examples or methods of dealing with data qualities such as security, recoverability, portability, in particular for making their objectives quantified requirements? Yeah,
so particularly in the security arena, I think that the challenge has in many organizations that I've worked with over recent years been particularly focused around the shift to cloud, and at the same time we've had the introduction of things like GDPR. There are all sorts of other challenges in how data is managed in that sort of secure environment. I think that the way in which data has, for want of a better way of describing it, mushroomed, I suppose. We've talked about big data for many years, but in reality, the explosion in data through things like internet technology, social media, has presented more challenges, I think, to organisations in the last 5 or 6 years than I would say has been the case for decades before that. In terms of the examples, I would say that they're probably wrapped up more in the sort of information risk management space than purely the data strategy arena. A lot of it comes down to, with things like cloud, the standpoint that an organization takes. So, for example, I know from a public sector perspective, where the data is held becomes exceedingly challenging, because it's not just where the first line of servers may be contained and identifying those, but it's then in a complex cloud architecture where those backup systems or secondary systems reside, and how do you provide any sort of tracking through a cloud provider to be able to give assurance to how that data is then managed from end to end is particularly difficult. So it's probably beyond the bounds of what I would cover within the data strategy, but it certainly from a data compliance perspective, and from a how do I demonstrate that I'm compliant, becoming a more complex world as data increasingly is held outside the control of an organization in those sorts of cloud environments or through the use of social media.
Excellent, thank you. Last question, I think this is the last question, from Kevin Garwood. Have you ever faced a challenge in limiting the stakeholders to consult when building a data strategy?
In limiting the stakeholders? So I generally would say that the challenge is probably less about limiting them and getting the attention in most organizations. Often I would say that in organizations, data sits in a particular area and is seen to be the responsibility of an area. And through things like data governance, I think that breaking down those barriers so that data is owned and regarded as an asset across an organization, and understood that it's used across an organization, has probably increased attention, but I still think there's a lot to be done. And I would suggest that if you're in a situation where you have many stakeholders, that's probably a positive. That would suggest that it's an organization in which there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of potential support. There may be conflict of different views that you have to juggle, but at the end of the day, facilitating those discussions is what managing data in complex organizations is all about. So I've never really struggled in terms of having to limit it. I think it's actually a very positive thing to have many people interested and engaged, and a catalyst for getting some real traction in being able to deliver value from a data strategy.
Okay, that's interesting. Can I ask then, for the data strategy, who develops the data strategy? Is it one person or a team of people?
I think it can be either, and of course it depends on the size of the organisation. I was speaking a while ago, shortly after writing the book, to somebody working in a charity organisation. They were basically on their own, writing a data strategy, and their challenge was, you talk about a project management office, you talk about a team, and I'm all of those things, and so it can be. It has to adapt to suit the organisation that you're in. I think that inevitably the complexity of the organisation and the number of willing hands that you can get to be part of that implementation team, or the team that defines the data strategy, will be linked to the pace at which you're able to go. If it is one person's effort in an organisation of many thousands, then it will take longer to be able to pull this together, because of the number of stakeholders that you should be consulting and the engagement that involves. So there isn't a right and a wrong answer. I think that having a broad spectrum of representation from across the organisation is important, because that brings with it the wealth of experience and knowledge to understand what the pressures are across an organisation, and trying to work out how you get the synergy of delivering one thing that potentially helps, half a dozen areas, rather than just one thing that helps one area, and hence drives that value faster.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, for your excellent presentation and really useful insight. I'm sure everyone found that very useful.